Good morning, folks, and thank you all so much for coming out to the sixth and final questions that you submitted to us in response to his final lecture this week. We've got a lot to run through minds. We've opened up 2 new courses for registration, and they will begin. Then our fearless leader, Dr. Peter Harris, a really exciting new series looking at the cultural movements that flourished in the post-war decades. Should be, I think, be of real interest to all of you who have enjoyed this series on the Age of Upheaval. So Peter and I will give you a little preview of that series at the end of our Q&A. But in the meantime, I'd love to dive right into the great questions that you submitted to us in response to his final lecture.
And questions you teased
questions and expertises to each of these series, and that's certainly the case in the first question that we're going to run through this morning, which comes from our old friend and Curious Minds veteran Sharon Harris, who wrote in with a very thorough and detailed question asking about Walter Chrysler, namesake of the famous Chrysler building, who was, as she pointed out, an extremely wealthy mechanic turned entrepreneur, and with Van Allen, the architect maker in North America. She tells us that he personally paid $25 million that's in 1930 dollars for the construction of the building because he wanted to leave it to his 2 sons. But her big question.
I was interested to hear you say that Sharon is a sort of veteran of the Curious Minds series, Will. And your lead-in, at least as well as I can, or maybe even better, but it's a really good one. And I just had to concentrate on the building itself when I was talking about it. But Walter Chrysler is one of those amazing figures that surfaced in the United States in the first part of the 20th century. Again, a child of immigrants. A sly comment there on the current state of politics in the United States. Anyway, he got his start in railway, actually. He was always interested in machinery. He built, which was apparently a white touring roadster, he had delivered, and he spent the next year or 2 taking it apart and putting it together again. So people wondered, well, aren't you going to drive the damn thing? And he eventually did, but it just shows his passion for the minutiae of machinery. And so in 1911, actually, he was invited by another famous name in car history, Nash. So he started doing that in 1911. He learned and introduced a pretty wealthy man, I'd say. Well, that didn't work out so well. He went to Maxwell, and he then turned Maxwell Motor Company into the Chrysler Corporation in 1925. And he very quickly bought out the Dodge brothers. He introduced the sort of case in the Chrysler building, which of course was in downtown Manhattan. Now, the big car show was in, I think it was in Queens or the Bronx. I forget exactly where. But anyway, people thought, oh, nobody's going to come to Manhattan when all the action is in, let's say, the Bronx. Well, on the day that the car show opened, a blizzard closed off the Bronx. And so everyone went to see his Chrysler C6. An amazing success. He sold 32,000 of them. In the very with Henry Ford and some of the other people. That great question. Thank you very much for that.
A remarkable American success story, for sure. Napier, New Zealand, where he had the exciting opportunity to attend their Art Deco festival, which is held every February. The town is as rich, he tells us, as South. Would you be able to tell us a little more, Peter, about how
art of Napier, New Zealand? Well, in fact, lots of people have, because of that Art Deco designation and the way they rebuilt. It's a fairly small town. And I too had the privilege of being a good look at most of the Art Deco buildings there. And I want to go to the share screen for just a moment to show you one of the pictures from our excursion into Napier. So this is what greeted us when we got off the ship. You can see it in the background. The townspeople of Napier are so proud and so on. It was a great start to our introduction to what it was like to be in Napier, New Zealand. And lots of this time, the early 30s, of course, Art Deco spread quite quickly all over the world. You know that it was from my previous talk, that it was in New York in 1925, and then the Chrysler building, the Channon building, the Empire State building, and so on. Miami Beach, as Michael mentioned, is also a great spot for Art Deco. But I also showed a picture of Shanghai in our last Q&A. It too had several Art Deco buildings, and so does Melbourne. Word spread, people came. Paris was, of course, a premier tourist spot for an ocean cruise, and they brought back the message, plus magazines and picture magazines and so on and so on. So it spread even to small communities like Napier. It was leveled, as you were mentioning, in the air, if I may use in a positive note. Art Deco by this point had gone viral.
Okay, well, I came to the U.S. To create any of the Art Deco buildings and
adjustable side table, sort of. Yeah, a few did come to the United States. One case in mind is Edgar Brandt, who was a metal worker, and he did some of those amazing metal gates that I showed of the Channon building. But interestingly, a lot of the American architects went to Paris. And in fact, some of them had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the big news architecture school in the world at that point. And so many of them were there. Others were in Paris because of the exhibition des Arts Décoratifs that we've already talked about. So there was a lot of grounding with the designers who brought Art Deco to New York. You mentioned William Van Alen, the man who did the Empire State Building. Well, he too trained at the École des Beaux-Arts and was in Paris. And I'm sure that's where he got his introduction to the Art Deco, and designers going to France, then the other way around.
Shifting gears a little bit to the third cultural center at the COVID-19 pandemic began, there was an interesting New Yorker article about a festival that Esa-Pekka Salonen, the director of the LA Philharmonic, held that was inspired by the Weimar Republic, in which he presented a series of new and classic works from and inspired by that period. Can you comment on the enduring influence that the Weimar Republic has had on artists and creators of later generations? Has it become a kind of mythic place in the popular imagination?
Yeah, I think that's well put. It is a kind of mythic place. I mean, that concert that you talk about, I had read that article in the, I think it was the New Yorker too, about that. He featured Esa-Pekka Salonen, whom we knew from here years ago. He featured music by Kurt Weill, and we've talked about Kurt Weill being the musician with Bert Brecht on the Mahagoni and the Three Penny Opera, and Hindemith. And Hindemith was doing a lot of, jazz-inflected music in Berlin. Even prior to those two things I just mentioned, in the middle of the 20s in Berlin. And the fact is, the Weimar Republic became that mythic place. In fact, and it was also Berlin became that mythic place as a strong kind of simulacrum of the whole Weimar Republic. Not that there wasn't stuff going on elsewhere. There was some lively cultural events in Munich and Hamburg, but Berlin became a world city. And I think one of the reasons it occupies this mythic stance popped by the early 30s. So it was like this little hermetic architecture, like the Bauhaus, came to the United States. And that's one of the things, by the way, that I'll be talking about in the new course. So much happened there, and it was so violently choked off by the bloody Nazis that it has a kind of victim status underlining it too. So that's a really good insight about the music, but lots of other stuff too.
Right. It almost feels as though there was this utopian quality to this arts and cultural, and then so quickly one of your earlier lectures, and based on Goodbye to Berlin, the Christopher Isherwood novel. So that it seems, and even more recently, there have been, I think, television series, one called Babylon Berlin. So it's a period and a place that lives on and captures the imagination of our contemporary artists, but also us in the audience who enjoy those stories so much.
Absolutely. The production values, by the way, of that Babylon Berlin are spectacular. That's the most expensive television program in German television history. And it's so persuasive. Yeah, so well mentioned, Will.
Questions, and indeed the broader series and broader historical journey you've taken us on over the last 6 weeks. And it's the idea of the cross-cultural exchange or dialogue that you were mentioning before. Shelley writes, between the German exodus to the United States and the American expatriates who settled in Paris, and the influence of American artists, especially African-American artists, on German artists in the Weimar era, is it fair to say that a cultural dialogue, or as Shelley put it, trialogue, did not occur in isolation?
Absolutely. What a terrific word, trialogue. I had never heard that before, Shelley, but I'm now going to consider it mine. And that's a lot of the political and social background that's happening. And in this time in the 20s, when it was, for the first time, you could really get this cross-fertilization happening. And it was a wonderful time for also in Berlin, as I was pointing out with Kreinek's opera, Jonny spielt auf, for instance. So yeah, a trialogue, as I like to think of it now, thanks to Shelley, is a really apt description of these currents flowing back and forth. Art Deco going back and forth. Later on, we're going to see international architecture going back and forth. Jazz being an amazing kind of a catalyst for music. And morphing into a lot of classical expression. So yeah, that's a great insight, Shelley.
Right, and I think, as you mentioned, Peter, I think it sort of is a nice of the post World War II decades. In a lot of ways, I think it will continue this incredibly rich dialogue that you establish in all your series between, as you say, cultural movements and political conditions. But it also, I think more specifically, it will kind of continue some of this historical narrative that you've developed over the course of this Age of Upheaval series.
Yeah, and the age of reinvention picks up on the age of change of turbulence that we've been upheaval that we've been talking about. And actually, just as a case in point, today, in case anyone happened to notice it in the Globe and Mail, today is the 75th anniversary date of the founding of the United Nations, which was a reinvention of the failed just prior to that. Well, in fact, after that, both of which we are definitely living with now. And later on that same year, 1945, was the first programmable digital computer, the ENIAC, which had some 20,000 vacuum tubes and weighed something like 37 tons. So it was hardly as portable as the little iPhones that we trot around with now, and didn't have nearly the same power as the iPhones did. So it's an abrupt start. And so those are some of the things, Russian and the war, can understand why that was not a good time to be having many children. So I've been getting quite excited as I've been going through this. And I hope that some of you out there listening and watching will feel that same excitement as we go along.
Absolutely. I mean, I have been feeling that excitement, Peter, just reading your descriptions of these upcoming lectures. And I think what I think is particularly interesting about this new series, and why I think it's sort of timely, is that I think we're tracing the emergence of the Cold War and this new political world order that emerged. We're going to also see artists and cultural movements that you're going to talk about, from abstract expressionism to where we are today. But we'll also offer, I think, some case studies that will be uplifting and hopeful for us to consider as well. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege to take this historical journey with you over the last 6 weeks. And I'm so excited that it will continue into the summer with the Age of Reinvention. I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to all our friends at home for tuning in over the last 6 weeks.
Everyone, hope to see you soon. Bye for now.
Bye for now.